May 4th, 1970, was a beautiful Midwestern day that belied the violence that was about to occur. Members of the Ohio National Guard appeared on the campus of Kent State University with orders to disperse a crowd of unarmed students protesting the Vietnam War. First, the soldiers tried tear gas, but the students stood their ground. Armed with M1 rifles, a contingent of confused guardsmen opened fire on them, killing 4 and wounding 9 others in one of the most shocking acts of violence to occur on a college campus.
Abnormia.
Welcome to Murder You, an Abnormia original, a true crime series exploring the most shocking murders worldwide. I'm your host, Maddie. This week's episode is the Kent State Massacre. Before we begin, please like and subscribe to our channel for all the latest Murder You content. Let's get started.
The Kent State Massacre is one of the most tragic and defining moments in American history. It's very different than the other cases we've covered, and it's a complex story involving several factors that led to this shocking incident. The incident unfolded during a period of intense national unrest over the Vietnam War and has since become a symbol of the deep divisions in the United States.
While I won't get into the current political climate in America, I will say that this story is more relevant than ever as our country is, unfortunately, deeply divided. So let's start with some background and context about the events leading up to this incident. By 1970, the Vietnam War had been raging for over a decade, with mounting U.S. casualties and widespread opposition at home. President Richard Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia on April 30th, 1970, was intended to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines. However, this was seen by many as an escalation of the war, contradicting Nixon's previous promises to end U.S. involvement. The Cambodian campaign sparked a new wave of protests across college campuses nationwide, where anti-war sentiment was particularly strong. Students viewed the invasion as a betrayal, further eroding trust in the government. Kent State University, located in Kent, Ohio, was no exception to the rising tide of anti-war protests. The campus had experienced smaller demonstrations in the past, but the announcement of the Cambodian invasion ignited an intense backlash. The university's student body was sharply divided between anti-war protesters and conservative groups that supported U.S. actions in Vietnam. On May 1st, 1970, a protest was held on the Commons, a central grassy area of the Kent State campus. Students buried a copy of the U.S. Constitution, symbolizing its perceived death under the Nixon administration. Later that evening, anti-war sentiments spilled into downtown Kent, leading to broken windows and minor clashes with police. Kent's mayor, Leroy Satrum, requested assistance from Ohio Governor James A. Rhodes. He mobilized the National Guard and arrived the next day to restore control. On May 2nd, tensions escalated when protesters set fire to the ROTC building on campus, a symbol of military presence. Firefighters attempting to extinguish the blaze were stopped by angry protesters. The building burnt to the ground, and confrontations between guardsmen and demonstrators continued into the night, with tear gas filling the campus and numerous arrests being made. On May 3rd, Governor Rhodes held a press conference in which he condemned the protesters as the worst type of people that we harbor in America, compared them to revolutionaries, and promised to use all necessary force to restore order. Rhodes wasn't the only person trashing the protesters in the days leading up to the calamity. On May 2nd, reporters overheard President Nixon referring to them as bums blowing up campuses. After the incident at Kent State, this remark would prove politically disastrous. Rhodes, for his part, indicated that he would seek a court order declaring a state of emergency. This was never done, but the widespread assumption among both Guard and university officials was that a state of martial law was being declared, in which the Guard rather than the university controlled the campus. It's worth noting that Rhodes was 3 days away from running unsuccessfully in the Republican primary for the United States Senate. The governor's inflammatory rhetoric heightened tensions, painting the student protesters as enemies of the state. The National Guard, led by their commander, General Robert Canterbury, tried to maintain control on campus, but the presence of soldiers only escalated the situation. Later, General Robert Canterbury testified that he had no direct responsibility for the weapons used, whether they were loaded, the tactics of the troops, or the methods of dispersing students. That leaves you wondering why Canterbury was there at all. It certainly wasn't to lead or make decisions that could have saved lives. Instead, on May 4th, he gave Lieutenant Colonel Charles Fassinger a mission to disperse the demonstrators. According to Canterbury, the decision to carry loaded weapons was up to the unit commanders. Despite a campus ban on gatherings, at noon, around 3,000 students had assembled at the Commons to protest the presence of the National Guard and the Cambodian invasion. The protest appeared to have been peaceful until the soldiers moved in. About 100 Ohio National Guardsmen, stationed near the now destroyed ROTC building, were called upon to break up the protest. General Robert Canterbury ordered the protesters to disperse. A Kent State Police officer riding in a military jeep made the announcement using a bullhorn to order the students to disperse. The guardsmen, equipped with M1 Garand rifles, bayonets, and tear gas, moved on the grassy field where the students were assembled. Some protesters reportedly threw rocks at the soldiers. Most stood their ground and refused to be intimidated. The soldiers fired off tear gas, but it proved ineffective due to wind conditions. The guardsmen then advanced, pushing the students back as the protesters stood their ground. Many assumed the guardsmen's rifles were loaded with blanks. At approximately 12:24 p.m., a contingent of guardsmen reached the crest of Blanket Hill. According to reports, the soldiers abruptly turned and fired into the crowd of students. Jeffrey Miller, a 20-year-old protester at the front of the crowd, was shot through the mouth at a range of about 270 feet and died instantly. Allison Krause, a 20-year-old protester, was shot in the chest. Known for her peace advocacy, she had reportedly placed a flower in a guardsman's rifle barrel earlier that weekend, and was quoted as saying, "Flowers are better than bullets," just days before she was killed by the hail of fire. 20-year-old Sandra Scheuer and 19-year-old William Schroeder were walking between classes and were not involved in the protest. Nevertheless, they were shot and killed from nearly 400 feet away. Schroeder was a member of the ROTC and was attempting to move away from the chaos when a bullet struck him in the back.
The soldiers discharged between 61 and 67 rounds in just 13 seconds, striking protesters and bystanders alike as they fled. Aside from the 4 people killed, 9 others were wounded, one of whom was permanently paralyzed. The indiscriminate nature of the shooting intensified the shock and outrage, which extended to many who didn't even support the student protests.
Whether or not there was an order to fire remains unclear, with conflicting testimonies about whether a direct order was given. Witnesses, including some of the guardsmen, reported hearing a command that sounded like "fire." Others claimed it might have been a misunderstood order like "hold your fire" or "prepare to fire." Sergeant Matthew McManus, one of the 8 National Guardsmen later indicted and acquitted for the Kent State shootings, vividly recalled the moment the line of troops abruptly turned at the hilltop. Wearing gas masks and following each other's movement by instinct, their rifles began lowering in unison, like a domino effect. McManus saw another officer racing along the line, trying to redirect weapons skyward. Realizing shots had already begun, he shouted, "Raise your weapons and fire 1 round in the air," then dropped to the ground himself, hoping to prevent further bloodshed.
Eyewitnesses describe a chaotic scene of screaming, students collapsing in pools of blood, and others rushing to help the wounded. One of the most iconic images from the event shows 14-year-old runaway Marianne Vecchio kneeling over Jeremy Miller's body, her her face contorted in a scream of anguish.
In the minutes following the shooting, the campus was a scene of pandemonium. As students tried to aid the wounded, guardsmen reformed their lines, warning that they would fire again if the crowd did not disperse. Fearful and traumatized, most of the students retreated. Reporters and photographers on the scene captured the horror, with images of blood-soaked pavements and stunned students making front-page news nationwide. The incident was broadcast almost immediately, causing an explosive national reaction. A subsequent FBI investigation claimed to have found no conclusive evidence regarding who issued the command or whether it was a tragic misunderstanding. But they certainly knew much more than they revealed to the public at the allegations of a cover-up emerged, fueled by the destruction of potential evidence, including logs and radio communications. Critics argued that the Nixon administration and Ohio officials sought to protect the guardsmen and deflect blame onto the students. Some suggest that the shooting was a panicked response rather than a coordinated attack, which seems to be a plausible scenario considering the terrible decisions that brought the situation to that point. Many of the guardsmen were around the same age as the students, so the situation must have been confusing and perhaps even terrifying. It was a horrible situation they should have never been put in. Still, the fact remains that these soldiers, whether following orders or confused, took the lives of 4 young students. News of the killings spread rapidly, sparking outrage and a wave of protests across the United States. Over 4 million students participated in strikes, temporarily closing more than 900 colleges and universities. Kent State was closed for the remainder of the semester, as were many other schools. The Kent State Massacre also deepened the generational and ideological divide in America, symbolizing the lethal consequences of governmental suppression of dissent. The incident inspired Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young to write and record a song titled Ohio, which was released just 10 days after the tragic event. Tin Soldiers and Nixon Coming, we're finally on our own. This summer, I hear the drumming. 4 dead in Ohio, they sing in the now iconic song. If you haven't heard it, I urge you to check out that powerful protest song. In the days following the massacre, President Nixon's administration offered a lackluster response, initially blaming the students for provoking violence. In a press conference, Nixon said, "When dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy," which struck many as cold, to say nothing of the irony of calling in the National Guard and arming them with weapons of war. Soon after the incident, according to a Gallup poll, most Americans believed the protesters were primarily to blame. Over the years, that sentiment would change dramatically. An FBI investigation, known as the Scranton Commission, concluded that the shootings were unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable, but failed to result in criminal charges against the guardsmen involved. The guardsmen who shot at the crowd claimed they did so in self-defense. They testified that they felt their lives were in danger. Many claimed the protesters advanced on them in a threatening way that warranted shooting, but that seems dubious. Some historians have accused the guardsmen of conspiring to shoot the students before they retreated up Blanket Hill, but the theory has never been proven.
In 1974, 8 members of the Ohio National Guard were indicted by a federal grand jury, but all charges were dismissed due to a, quote, lack of evidence that the guardsmen intended to kill. I mean, they had loaded rifles, they aimed them at students, and they fired. Someone should have been held accountable, and ultimately, no one was.
A civil lawsuit filed by the victims and their families resulted in a $675,000 settlement in 1979 and a statement from the guardsmen expressing regret, but not admitting wrongdoing.
The Kent State shooting had a profound impact on American society, significantly weakening public support for the Vietnam War and amplifying distrust in government institutions. It underscored the dangers of militarizing responses to civil protests, and it remains a powerful symbol of the cost of political repression.
Over the years, Kent State University has taken steps to memorialize the tragedy. including establishing the May 4th Visitor Center and permanent markers indicating where each student fell. The event is commemorated annually, serving as a reminder of the perils of excessive force and the importance of safeguarding civil liberties. The Kent State Massacre was a watershed moment in American history, marking a turning point in public perception of the Vietnam War and the U.S. government. The deaths of 4 students brought the violence of distant battlefields to our nation's doorstep, igniting a legacy of activism and a continued demand for accountability and justice. Today, the lessons of Kent State resonate powerfully, reminding us of the fragile balance between authority and freedom in a democratic society. There's much debate about who was to blame for the Kent State shootings, but the one thing we can all agree on is that it should never happen again. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you or anyone you know needs to report a crime anonymously, contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS or visit their website at csusa.org.
Abnormia.